Hello, welcome to another Parallel Project Training podcast. These podcasts are for the APM PMQ exam and syllabus that is launching in September 2024. Today, we're going to be talking about risk and issue management, and I'm here with Carmen Campos, who is one of our senior trainers. Welcome to the podcast, Carmen.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. So what we're going to do is look at the learning objective about risk and issue management from the syllabus and look at each of the learning outcomes in a little bit more detail and talk through each of the elements about risk and issue management. The main objective is to understand risk and issue management as the ability to identify and monitor risks, both threats and opportunities, more about that later, and to plan responses to those risks and respond to issues. Our first learning outcome is to understand the benefits of risk and issue management and the role of contingency planning in projects. I think we'll talk about contingency planning a little bit later. Carmen, let's start at the beginning then. What's a risk? What's an issue? And how are they different?
Good question. A risk is something that, if it happens, will have an impact on the project. It may or may not happen, but if it does, will have impact. And when I said impact, I mean things like impact to cost, time, quality, or impact on the things that the project delivers, impact to the outputs, the outcomes, and benefits. An issue, on the other hand, is something that is happening or has happened and will have an impact on all those things, the cost, the time, quality, the benefits. So this is the core difference.
So risks, we're talking about something that might happen in the future. Issues, we're talking about matters at hand, things that have happened, but both of them have got the same types of impact, haven't they?
Yeah, exactly. So for example, if we try to deliver this podcast today, and my internet provider sent me an email last night and said, we're doing maintenance work and may have an impact on your connection, that is a risk. It may happen, it may not, but if it happens, it will have an impact on our podcast recording. Yeah. Whereas if I wake up in the morning and there is no internet and I call my provider and they said the internet service has been suspended until midnight today, that is an issue. It will still impact the objectives, but it actually has occurred.
That's really clear. Now, in the learning objective, it said that risks were threats and opportunities. I think most people, when you say this is a risk, they think it's something bad, dangerous that's going to happen. How can it be an opportunity as well?
And this is a very common conception. This morning I went to the Cambridge Dictionary to check a definition for risk, and it's associated with things that have negative impact or pose a danger should they occur. Interestingly, that was added into the syllabus back in the 90s. The PMI introduced that in 1996, and then APM also adopted that in 1997. So you may think, wow, it's been more than 25 years since that officially was introduced, but still the world sees risk as something that is going to pose a threat rather than opportunity.
We need to look at risk as uncertainty, uncertain events. They can be positive, but they can be negative.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think for all the project managers listening to us today, it will be a really interesting reflection to go back after this podcast and think, okay, when we do risk management, how good we really are at opportunity management.
Definitely. Okay, so that's risks and issues and risk and issue management. What's the benefit of doing that on our project? It seems as if this is going to take me away from the focus on delivering the output.
So the benefits are very similar for both risk management and issue management. Essentially, it's about increasing the project chances to deliver the success criteria. You know, things like deliver to time, cost, quality, no one gets hurt, the project achieved the outcomes that they intended to. If we don't have a sound risk and issue management processes, that is less likely to happen. So by having a clear process, we have a good decision-making process. So we have clear mechanisms to prioritize our actions and focus on the things that could hurt or benefit the project most. These are benefits for the project manager, but there are benefits as well for stakeholders, benefits for the team. The confidence of the stakeholder will increase. The stakeholders will trust that the project is in good hands by thinking about those uncertainties in the case of risk, and also by having a mechanism to resolve issues before they escalate into big problems. The motivation of the team will be increased.
If you're in this ideal world project, if you do risk management so well, you should never have to do issue management. But of course, we all live in the real world. So although we should be really good at doing risk management, we're never going to be able to foresee everything. So we've also got to have a really good process at dealing with stuff when it does actually happen.
Yes, exactly. And for risk and issue management, the more we do it, the better we become. You learn from experience. Absolutely. And you become much better, and you make better informed decisions in future projects, knowing how we reacted to issues, how risks were mitigated, if the mitigations were effective. So that is a huge knowledge for organizations.
In the beginning of a new project, when I'm thinking about what risks could occur, is have a look at the issues that occurred on previous projects. I don't want them to become issues on this project. I'll treat them as risks when they haven't actually happened. That continuous learning is so important on these two topics.
Yeah, and also in the current world that we live in, especially with the arrival of AI, having all that information, all that repository, you could benefit from technology and try to help decision making.
That's a really interesting thought. So I think we've knocked learning outcome A on the head now. Let's have a look at the next one. So what we've got to look at here is to understand the purpose and importance of each stage in a risk management process, and then do the same with an issue management process. And as we talk about each of those stages in the risk and issue management process, we need to think about why they're going to be different if you're working on a project that has a linear life cycle as opposed to one that has an iterative life cycle. Let's take each of those stages in turn, first of all for risk management, and have a think about each of those things.
So let's begin with identification. So the purpose really is to try to capture any uncertain event that happening will cause impact to that project. And there is not just one way of doing that. A good project professional will have to use a combination of things. You mentioned one of that, Ruth. You said, I'll look at the previous projects, look at the previous issue logs. You have to involve team members, experts, stakeholders, in order to try to capture all of that, and most importantly, document it in the risk register. So the purpose really is to try to document all of that and to try to think about everything that could go wrong or could have a positive impact. It's really an important step that often is a bit overlooked.
I couldn't agree more in terms of getting stakeholders involved. This shouldn't just be the project manager's view of the world. It really has to be a holistic view of the project. There are so many different sources for risk. There are so many things that feed into this identification. So that then takes us on to the next step, which is analysis.
The key two parameters will be the probability or likelihood of the risk occurring, and the second one will be the impact. So if that risk happened, what will be the impact? And to do that, again, you could use different techniques. You could use a more qualitative techniques. For example, a probability impact grid. You could plot all these risks based on probability and impact and give them a rank. Some people use like red, amber, green, or very low, low, medium, high, very high.
Yeah.
Benefits of that is quite quick, straightforward. You don't need any statistical calculations. It's a bit subject to subjectivity. I'm an optimist, Ruth, so I sometimes offer from over-optimism. But maybe other team members are more pessimistic. So this is another step that I always encourage everyone to do it as part of the team.
It's really important to do this with stakeholders. I just went through this process, and it was really interesting to get other people's views on what the probability of certain risks were, what the impact of certain risks were, because they were certainly different from my opinions.
That's one of the benefits of having governance. If you have a reference point as to what is low, what is high, that will really help to make sure we're using commonality of approach and commonality of language when we score the risk. Now, on the other hand, some projects that are more complex may want to go down the route of a more quantitative risk analysis. This is more based on some mathematical methods, more statistical calculations, but that is much more elaborated way of doing it.
And you'll probably have a team of risk managers, specialist risk managers,
and experts
doing that.
Sometimes you might have a risk management function in your PMO, which helps you with that.
So we've identified our risks, we've analysed our risks. All of that information's gone into the risk register. We've got some steps now, monitoring and escalation.
Okay, so now we know the relative severity of this risk. The risk management plan will also define the tolerances, okay? So there will be some risks that probably need to be escalated. We cannot possibly react or deal with every possible risk in the same way. If you have a risk register with 150 risks, you cannot deal with them in exactly the same way. So this is why the ranking you did during the analysis will help you to monitor and escalate, if necessary, things that are already outside that tolerance.
This is where the risk management side of things becomes important. When you've just identified and analysed your risks and you've documented those in your risk log, you haven't changed anything. You just know more about what could happen in the project. Now we're starting to get into those steps where we're doing something active about our risk. This is really going to start helping our project. It's important for me that project managers don't just open up a risk register, put the risks in, analyse the risks, do a nice grid. You've got to monitor, you've got to escalate when tolerances are being threatened or you need somebody higher up in the hierarchy to make decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so responses then is our next step. So this is now going to bring in another learning outcome. The third learning outcome is that you've got to know about the proactive and reactive responses to risk. So when we respond to risk, what can we possibly do about these risks?
So in general, the purpose is really to decide what's the most appropriate way to respond to the risk. And we said earlier that risk could be threats or opportunities. If we start with threats that will have a negative impact on the project, there are essentially 4 things that we could do. So we could avoid the risk, which means completely eliminate it. Let's use an example again.
You got an email saying that your broadband provider, there might be an outage today when we're recording this. So how could we actually avoid that risk? How could we eliminate that risk?
We need to think about the cause and effect. The risk is that the internet may go down. So when you avoid the risk, you completely eliminate that risk event. Okay? So in this case, would be using a different provider. Okay? So when you think about avoiding the risk, you need to think about that event, that potential event that if it happens, will affect our call. So avoiding will be just not using that. We could potentially reduce the probability or the impact. We could think about having a backup plan. Okay, if that happens, I'm going to use the data of my phone so Ruth and I can carry on with the call. So that will reduce the impact because we said at the start, it may not happen. It may all work wonderfully and we never be impacted by that internet supply issue. So that will be the second one. We have avoiding, eliminating altogether. We're not taking any chances. Reduce the probability or the impact. The third one could be to transfer that risk to someone that may be best placed. Okay, so in the example of the project using a new technology, you may work with a supplier that provides that technology and transfer the risk to them. So instead of just supplying the equipment or the technology, they actually take the management of that risk, maybe by conducting the work themselves. And the last one would be to accept it. Okay, Ruth, so we accept it. There is a risk that may happen, and if it happens, we deal with that. And this is where contingencies may be put aside. Okay, we could say, well, if it happens, we schedule our call to tomorrow. But if it doesn't happen, we just do it as planned. So these are the four threats. The one for opportunities are very similar. They almost mirror each other. So we maybe reject the opportunity. That's reactive. You're not interested. Maybe the opportunity presents other risk that may be more significant, and that will be the equivalent of accepting the risk in the threats. Both of them reactive. All the others are proactive, so you could exploit the opportunity.
Okay, so is that the diametric opposition to avoiding it?
Yeah, exactly. So they will be analogous to avoiding. You could enhance the opportunity, which means you make it even bigger. And often exploiting an opportunity and enhancing opportunity may require a change in the scope, may require a change in the schedule, because you proactively do things to benefit from it. So this is why sometimes we need to be a little bit careful, because the priority is still to deliver the project objective. So we need to think very carefully about secondary risk.
That's a really good point. We've got to be very, very careful about scope management when it comes to exploiting and enhancing, because sometimes people can get a little bit carried away. Before you know it, your scope is just getting bigger and bigger because you're trying to take advantage of this opportunity. Sometimes the right thing to do is reject the opportunity, because otherwise it's going to take our project a little bit too much off track and increase the budget, for example.
Exactly. And then the other mirror one is the sharing the opportunity. Very similar to transfer. So you work with someone, could be a third party, a contractor, to try to get that opportunity. So that could be the opportunity to get an incentive if you finish the project, I don't know, ahead of schedule. So these are, in a nutshell, the key responses to threats and opportunities.
That's our response step. And different types of proactive and reactive responses, depending on whether it's a threat or an opportunity. Our final step in the risk management process is closure.
Very important step. So at some point during the project, there will be some risks that didn't manifest, or perhaps at the stage where the risk was likely to happen is already finished. There is another scenario where maybe when you avoid the risk, you completely eliminate it. So there is no point to keep the risk open in the risk register. You need to keep the risk register up to date. And the purpose of closure is to ensuring that the project doesn't keep open any things that are not having any more chances to occur. It helps the project manager as well. It may release some contingencies for things that we know are not going to happen anymore. And also it's very good for communication. It's very important to do due diligence and just update the risk register, because we know future projects could benefit from that knowledge and that information.
Yeah, absolutely. We've mentioned contingency and contingency planning quite a few times. So let's do a summary now. What is contingency planning and why is it important? How's it linked to risk management?
Contingencies in general will be things that we put aside. Typically, when we talk about contingencies, we talk about contingencies in the schedule or cost contingencies. So there will be those things we put aside to try to respond to identify risk, or maybe risk that we didn't foresee in the risk management process. So things that are completely unknowns, because we cannot possibly foresee everything. So the purpose is to try to cover that gap. Try to cover that gap between the exposure of the risk that we identify, and that will depend as well on the governance and the levels of confidence and the levels of uncertainty that the project has. And the contingency has to be planned in proportion to that. The contingency will be split often into different levels. Governance will decide how the contingencies is split. That risk management process will derive some of the contingencies. Contingencies will be set for risks that we couldn't eliminate, or we didn't reduce the probability or the impact and they just occurred. We need to deal with that. Organizations need to have a proportion of contingency as well, sometimes shared as a program management level or portfolio management level for those unknown unknowns, because they need to cover as well in case that the project encounters an issue that we didn't foresee as part of our risk management process, like the COVID, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is why contingency is sometimes split into different levels of authority. And often people refer to that as a management reserve. So the management reserve is that contingency whole at higher level in the organization.
Yeah. I again, to reiterate your point, it's really important that this is shown and discussed transparently. It's not hidden. It's not money that you find down the back of the sofa or anything like that. It's planned into your project proactively.
Yes.
We've talked about all of the stages in the risk management process now, about risk responses. Let's look at the issue management process and walk through each of the stages there to see what happens, and then look at both of those processes and how they differ between linear and iterative life cycles. So tell me about an issue management process. This is now about managing those things that are actually happening and are having an impact on our project. So what do we do when something unexpected has actually happened?
So the steps are very similar to the risk management. So we need to identify issues, obviously in a different way, because issues are now happening, are affecting the project tolerances. We need to document in the issue log, and proactive documentation there will ensure that everyone is aware of the issue and we can plan a course of action to minimize the impact on the project before it escalates into a major problem. Once that has been identified, we populate some of the information as well in the issue log, similar to the risk register. We need to do some analysis as well. We need to try to get more understanding and doing an evaluation in terms of the impact. For obvious reason, we don't think of probability anymore, but we need to think about what are the impact to the timescales, impact to cost, maybe impact to quality, impact to the benefits. And that is going to help categorizing and prioritizing the issue. The APM has a particular definition of issues. In the glossary, the APM defines issues as things that are breaching the tolerances for work on a project. For that reason, in definition with the APM, all the issues have to be escalated for support. So sponsor probably to start with, a senior management team, depending on the magnitude of the issue.
We'll talk about governance, but that's a really good example of why governance is very important within this process.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Once we have escalated that, an appropriate course of action will be defined. It's not just enough to put it in the issue log. The project manager needs to track that proactively. Sometimes that issue may lead into some changes as well. So often issues enact change control because we may have to change, or the issues may affect the boundaries of the project and the baseline. So it's very important that whichever the course of action has been agreed, the project manager track the resolution until it's closed, because we need to ensure that it has been effective. As part of the course of action, you may be giving more support in terms of resources. Costs have been released to help dealing with that issue. But particularly for things like lessons learned, it's very important to keep the issue log up to date, similar with the risk register.
Let's think about how these stages might be different if we were working on a linear life cycle project as opposed to a project with an iterative life cycle. What are your thoughts on that? How is risk management different?
That's an interesting question, because in my view, the key steps of the risk management process is the same. It's more the approach. Linear projects will have more structured risk management, typically because the scope is well defined at the start. The project manager with the team may be able to identify and plan those risks much earlier in the life cycle. And because you do the risk management for the whole project, you will have to have a more comprehensive approach. But they need to be reviewed continuously throughout the project life cycle regardless. Now, because iterative projects break down the project into sprints, the risk management process is more fluid, and also I would say it's more adaptive as well, because scope may be reprioritized, risks will be identified for each of the iteration, and then when you move on to the next one, you repeat the process again. It's far more flexible than in linear projects.
There's a few things that for me on this one, because you've got that bigger design up front with a linear project, you're able to identify the risks up front, whereas Agile deliberately is changing scope and therefore we'll be identifying new and different risks as we go through each of those sprints. But it's really important that we don't just think that risk management, or particularly risk identification and analysis, is done once up front on a linear project. It needs to be something that we're always thinking about throughout the life cycle, because the external environment can change as well, can't it? We've always got to be thinking about new risks continuously throughout our project.
Absolutely.
What I'd like us to talk about now is how issue management might be done differently if we were working on a linear project as opposed to one with an iterative life cycle.
I'm probably going to repeat some of the things I said on the risk management, but my view is very similar with regards to issues. So both life cycles need to have a clear and sound process, following the same steps. The key difference between the two is that the linear approach is more structured, and you need to categorize and you need to analyze the issues based on the impact over the whole project life cycle. I need to keep in mind the definition of the APM, because issues are things that already exceeding the tolerances for the project, and the tolerances in iterative are resources and time. So I'm going to think about issue management in terms of maybe issues with the quality of the work, things that may affect those boundaries, the resources and time boxes. But I wanted to get your view on this, Ruth, because I'm maybe using the definition of issue mistakenly in other projects. What do you think?
That's a really interesting observation. If we think about issues in the way that we colloquially talk about issues,
Yes.
as you said, of just things that have happened, some problems, some concerns, just stuff that, we didn't expect it to happen. Agile's got a really nice process, very proactive at the beginning of the time box or the sprint. We'll be talking about any issues that exist in our daily stand-ups, our daily meetings. We'll be looking at what barriers there are to the team, and the project manager will be breaking down those barriers, removing those blockers. So we'll really be on it with issue management in an iterative project. At the end of the time box, then we'll look back and close issues off once they've been solved and pass things over into the next sprint. I think the difficulty comes then when, as you said, you apply the formal APM definition that these issues are things that are impacting or threatening on the tolerances, which is slightly different within Agile. In my experience, the issues that you experience on an Agile project are related to the things that you're producing, so your quality. So I think we can still get that definition that APM uses in there. We've just got to be thinking about the quality tolerances and the impacts on the quality tolerances on an iterative project. What do you think about that?
I tend to agree with that.
Another difference I observe is that in a linear project, the responsibility for managing the issue management process lies with the project manager. Whereas the team within the Agile or iterative project is a lot more self-organising. Although the project manager is helping to resolve things and take away blockers from the project, the team is a lot more proactive on taking those responsibilities for issues rather than being assigned actions by the project manager, as you might see within a linear project. The last learning objective now is about governance. Yeah, the learning outcome is to understand why governance is important in risk and issue management. Tell me what governance actually is and how it relates to risk management.
We have a separate podcast for governance, but it's worth in this context to remind our audience that governance in general refers to the frameworks, processes, the practice that we're going to use to ensure that the project deliver what is expected and ensure we align with the organizational goals. So if you take that into context of risk management, it's about having a solid decision-making process. It's about understanding what approach do you use for risk management, depending on which life cycle you have. It's about understanding the tolerances. So it's very important to adhere to that if you want to have an effective risk management process, because ultimately good governance will ensure that we manage those risks more systematically, and also roles and responsibilities are clear. So it's really intertwined with governance.
From my perspective, particularly on larger projects that might be central to the organisational purpose, it's important to recognise that large risks on those projects actually are risks, therefore, to the organisation itself. And so we need to make sure that project governance and organisational governance really are well aligned.
The project management plan, which is defined at the start, will also ensure that's taking into account, escalation routes, different levels of accountability and where the risks need to be managed. As you said, whether it's something really key for the organization, then it's going to be in the corporate risk register.
Why is governance important in issue management?
Again, probably very similar reasons. If we take it back to the definition of governance, in the issue management process, when the APM creates an issue management plan as part of the PMP, you have to have clear levels of accountability. You need to bear in mind which life cycle are you having, and you also need to set some tolerances. Back to the definition of issues, it says there are problems that are exceeding the tolerances. So governance is really key, because the project manager needs to know if it's within their remit to deal with that issue, or whether it needs to be escalated to the sponsor in the first place, or possibly all the way to the executive or senior management team if it's a big issue. So
Absolutely.
governance it plays a key role here, because otherwise we won't have a good decision-making process. The issue may lead to changes. The issue may need additional funding to be released, to be resolved. So having clear frameworks and having clear decision-making mechanisms are going to ensure that we have an effective issue management process.
Yeah, definitely. This is so important to make sure that the right people are making the right decisions here. That definition of the tolerances, of the accountabilities at each level is really important with dealing with issues. I love the term a watermelon project. I don't know if you've come across this, Carmen.
No,
I think that if we don't get governance in issue management working correctly, we have a watermelon project. It all looks green on the outside, but it's red and off track on the inside. We've got to make sure that if there is a problem, that is being escalated, dealt with, the project's being replanned or change controls being used, whatever has to happen, but the right people are being involved at the right time. That's why governance is important for me.
That's a brilliant analogy. I love that.
I quite like watermelon as well. Fantastic.
Great.
I think we've covered all of the learning outcomes now. In summary then, we started off talking about why risk management is important, what the benefits of risk management are to projects. We've talked you through each of the stages in a risk management process. We've talked about identifying risks, analysing their probability, their impact, how to monitor and escalate risks, and how to respond to risks. We talked about proactive and reactive responses to risks, both threats and opportunities. Don't forget about risks as opportunities as well. And then talked about how it's really important to keep on top of your risk management activities, make sure the risk register's up to date, close off risks that are no longer risks to the project. And then we finished up by looking at how risk management might be different in projects of different life cycle types, and why governance is really important. You walked us through the issue management process. We talked about logging issues in an issue log, analysing them, escalating and assigning actions. And then we've had a good discussion about how issue management might be done differently depending on whether your project has a linear or an iterative life cycle, and then finished off by talking about governance in issue management as well. So that's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Carmen.
Thank you, Ruth. Bye.
Bye.